It's always interesting just sitting there and hearing the accolades. I'm like, yeah, that's me. Who's that guy? Jax Book Fest 2023. How are we feeling today? That is a very commendable effort. And I know it might be a little early for some of you, but and I know we're just getting to know each other, so I don't want to come off too pushy. But there's some very important people here that can guarantee we continue to do awesome events like this, and I want to make sure they know that we want more great events like this. So with that in mind, let's try that one more time. Jax Book Fest 2023, how we feeling? That's good, that's good. The sound guy hates me right now. He's like, spiked levels and all that. All right, so once again, my name is Bader Milligan. I host the Short Box podcast. It is one of the longest running comic book podcasts in the industry. If you're a fan of hearing comic creators and lifelong comic fans wax poetics about comic books, making comic books, and all that good stuff, I implore you to join the Short Box Nation. Find us on whatever podcast app that you use. I guarantee it's worthy of your time. Shameless plugs aside, who's ready to bring on our keynote speaker? There we go. Most of you know who we got coming up on stage, but just in case there's that one person that just wandered about and was like, oh, a comfy seat. I think I'm going to take a load off. Your keynote speaker and Lit Chat author has been dubbed #1 New York Times bestseller so many times that I'm convinced that it's like part of his name. Like that's his first name at this point. #1 New York Times bestseller. Terrible jokes aside, he's the author of novels such as Heart-Shaped Box, The Fireman, and Full Throttle. Much of his work has been adapted into TV and film, like his second novel, Horns, which was translated into film in 2014 and stars Daniel Radcliffe. Most recently, his 2021 short story, The Black Phone, was adapted into a movie starring Ethan Hawke. And he hasn't just conquered long-form and short-form prose. He also got into the comic book realm in 2007 and co-created Lock and Key with, there we go. He co-created Lock and Key with artistic maestro Gabriel Rodriguez. Wait, did I get that one right? Yep, Gabriel Rodriguez. And went on to win the highly coveted Eisner Award for Best Writer in 2011. Most recently, he's returned to graphic novels. His latest comics include Basket Full of Heads and Plunge for DC Comics. You could definitely cheer for that. And Dying is Easy for IDW Comics. The accolades, as you can tell by now, go on and on and on, but I'm of the belief it's best to hear it from the person himself. So without further ado, you know, matter of fact, I want everyone to get up on their feet. Let's get on their feet for this one, all right? Jax Book Fest 2023. Let's go ahead and welcome Joe Hill to the stage.
Thanks so much, guys.
Mike.
Barton, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you for being in Jax. Thank you for being here. This is awesome.
It's terrific.
Yeah.
It's great. I got here, I did a workshop yesterday, and then I walked down to the river and saw dolphins. That was kind of cool.
Welcome to Florida.
Yeah. Well, I saw the fin come up, and I thought...
50-50 odds. Dolphin,
yeah.
Shark.
It was a dolphin. It was a dolphin.
It could have also been Florida man rocking fin in water, too. That's common, too. Joe, in the intro, I referenced all the New York Times, you know, times that you've been named New York Times bestseller, the Eisner Award for Best Writer. Can you recall what it was like winning your first, like, significant award or the moment where you were like, wow, I've arrived, like, I'm doing something? Like, does a memory stick out?
I think probably when my first novel came out, you know, it landed pretty well, and that was quite a shock to my system. Because at the time, I had a lot more experience of rejection than acceptance. If you were in my workshop yesterday, you heard some of this. I wrote 4 novels that I was never able to sell. Well, that's not quite true. The 4th of them I spent 3 years on. It was called The Fear Tree. And that book actually became a huge international bestseller in my imagination. But in real life, it was turned down by every publisher in New York City, every publisher in London, and then for a final humiliating kick in the nuts, it was turned down by every publisher in Canada, which goes to show that no matter how far you've fallen, there's always further, Rock bottom is a lot further down than you think. So Heart-Shaped Box came out in spring of 2007, and a lot of people dug it, and it sold really well, and that was for me quite a shock to the system. Yeah.
What do challenges and roadblocks look like for you, like now in your career, having been established and successful? Like, how has roadblocks and challenges? What do they look like now compared to starting out?
Well, when I started out, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew both my parents write, and I remember coming home from school from 8th grade, and my mom would be in her office. She had this tomato-colored IBM Selectric typewriter that shivered constantly like it had palsy, and she'd be in there banging at it. And then, my dad would be in his office, and he had a Wang word processor. It was a very early computer with a completely black screen and green letters on it, and you looked at that thing, and it just looked like the future. And he'd be in there playing make-believe, and I just thought that's what you were supposed to do, is that you were supposed to spend a couple hours every day sitting alone, playing make-believe, and eventually someone would pay you a lot of money for it, which turned out to be true. But when I was 18 and I started to think more seriously about publishing, I had a terror of publishing as Joseph King, because I was worried. I knew a lot of early work is not good, and I was worried someone would publish a bad novel by me because they saw a chance to make a quick buck and a famous last name. And so I dropped my last name and started writing as Joe Hill. And it seems improbable, but I was able to keep it a secret for a decade. But it was all pre-Google. It was all pre the internet as we understand it. I don't know if I would have lasted nearly that long if I was coming up today. And then I had a secret weapon which helped to keep me, anonymous, which was failure. It's surprising if you're not getting anything published, no one will really connect you to other people in publishing. But I look back at that time of writing stories and sending them out and getting dozens of turn downs, and I feel like that was healthy, time well spent, because when you're developing your craft, you need an opportunity to make your mistakes in private, where they belong. When I finally did begin to sell short stories, I was confident that I was selling them for the right reasons, because an editor really loved them and wanted to share them with readers. But I was also writing novels, and I wrote those 4 novels that I couldn't sell. And I would say that by about 2006, I had given up on the idea of being a novelist. I had decided by then that I took my best swing, and I didn't have it in me. But I was actually pretty chill about it. It was not that upset. And the reason why is I had written some short stories that I knew in my heart were good, and that I had sold places, and those stories had even won some awards or been in best-of collections. And on the strength of those stories, I got an opportunity to write an issue of Spider-Man for Marvel Comics. So before I was a novelist, I was a comic book writer. And I remember thinking, I was a young dad at that point, and I remember, I'd go out for diapers or something at 11 in the evening, because you never run out of diapers in the middle of the day. It's always 11 in the evening, and you're like, oh wow, we've got 1 diaper left. But I remember I'd go out, and I'd be thinking, about my possibilities, and I'd be thinking, well, maybe I don't get to be a novelist, but I might get a chance to write Ghost Rider someday. That'd be pretty cool, and so I was pretty much at ease with it. I had enough good short stories to make a collection. I couldn't sell the collection in America. I couldn't sell the collection to a big press in England, but a guy at a small press read 3 short stories, really liked it. He had taken chances on other first-time writers and stuff, so he agreed to publish my collection on the condition I would write a few new short stories for it that would be exclusive to the collection. I wrote 2 new short stories for it that came out really well, The Cape and I can't remember the other one. And then I started a third one, and that one was called Dead Man's Suit. And it was about this rock star who has a collection of macabre artifacts. He's got a tray-panned human skull. He's got a witch's confession from the 18th century. And he hears about a woman selling a ghost online, and he decides he wants to buy it for his collection. And I figured, if you've seen even one horror movie, you know this is a terrible idea. But I figured, he's going to buy this, he'll bring the ghost home, he realized he's made a terrible mistake, but it'll be too late, and this son of a bitch is going to eat it on page 30. But the problem was, the guy wouldn't die on my schedule. He was like a human cockroach. Every time I stomped on him, I'd lift my foot and he'd scuttle off again. And I got curious about how long he could keep going. Turned out he could keep going for 300 pages, and that's how I wrote my first novel.
Wow. So I promised that I was like, Butter, don't immediately jump to the comic books, ease into it. As a lifelong comic fan, and I'm kind of ashamed admitting this on a stage in front of all these people, I read Lock and Key for the first time like this month, getting ready for this. And I was blown away. I was like, why did it take me so long to check this out? And to add insult to injury, Lock and Key was on this list put out by Empire. It was 30 comic books you should have read, especially if your name is Botter. I was like, wow, they know me. And it got me thinking, do you have maybe a book, a comic, maybe even a movie, just pop culture in general, that you're maybe embarrassed about admitting, I haven't read that or I haven't seen that? Do you have I'm going to get to it, but it's on my, I just don't got time for it.
It's a deep list. It's a long, deep list. I mean, I've reached an age where I've written a bunch of stories about ghosts and vampires, and I wrote a story about werewolves, and so I'm now I'm a horror guy. And I get asked to write introductions for classic works of horror and stuff like that, and most of it I know pretty well, but I've never read Henry James' Turn of the Screw, which is just one of these classic ghost stories that it seems incredible that I'm 51 and I work in horror and I haven't read Turn of the Screw.
Are there I'm hearing audible gasps in the crowd.
Were there some gasps? In comic books, is there stuff in comics? See, I'm pretty widely read in comic books. I discovered Prince Valiant a few years ago and fell in love with that. Actually, Prince Valiant has kind of ruined me for modern comics. But is there some great comic stuff that I haven't read? Oh, I only read Arkham Asylum for the first time a couple years ago. And that seems like an amazing one to have dropped through the gaps.
Oh yeah, classic.
But yeah, there's always stuff that you haven't seen, you haven't read. Life is short. People's time is limited, and all you can do is read what you can.
Yeah. So, on your blog, on your website, you mentioned that one of the most recurring dreams you have is, quote, "I probably dream about going to Starbucks 3 nights out of 5. I too dream of Starbucks. But with that much coffee in your system, I imagine that you're either a night owl or an early riser. Do you have a preference? And do you have any rituals or routines that you do to get yourself creatively charged?
Well, I have 17-month-old twins, so I'm an early riser. It's not really about when I get up. In terms of, I do believe I am very habit-driven, and I do think that if writing fiction is your living, if you're lucky enough to get to do this for a living, because there's not that many of us who are, who have had the good fortune to, get to do this full time. I do think you're your own boss, and it is helpful if you're systematic, if so I have expectations about how long I'm going to work each day, about how much work I expect to get done. I have, a weekly goal, a monthly goal, a quarterly goal, and I'm certainly pretty good at hitting the weekly goal. I tend to misjudge the quarterly goal. It's sort of depressing, actually. I'm very robotic. On an ordinary day, I have 3 cups of tea, and I have them at exactly the same time. I used to listen to music when I wrote, and now I put on this playlist I've made of wave sounds, and it just sort of, I don't know, relaxes me, and then I can get 1,000 words. But it's not. There are a lot of books and movies about writers which suggest that their lives are interesting. And actually, it's not. It's a lot of sitting in the office, by yourself, sort of, and then tap a couple things, then tap a couple things, then you go back and delete a bunch of stuff. And what was the famous guy? It was Proust said he was out for a walk or something, and he said, I had a terrible morning. I only wrote 11 words. And his friend says, oh, that is so awful. Was the afternoon any better? And he says, yes, the afternoon was wonderful. I cut 3 of them.
You mentioned yesterday that you were here for, I think, the first day of the book fest, which was the Writers' Day, and you hosted a workshop about the power of perspective and leveraging perspective and writing. And I'm kind of beating myself up about not attending it, because that is a word that I use to describe and sell people on your books, is that you have this knack of writing characters, whether it's Judas Coin in Heart-Shaped Box, or the Locked Children in Lock and Key. It feels like as a reader you get teleported into the heads of these characters, and you're sitting right behind their eyeballs, you're seeing what they're seeing. And whether I agree with every decision or perspective they have, I can admit that they're relatable. They feel like real people. And I was curious, what's the secret or the process that goes into creating engaging and relatable characters?
Oh, man. Well, first of all, that's very kind. When I write a story, I don't want to be me. I know that there are some writers who write fiction where their lead characters tend to be slightly reimagined versions of themselves, often better versions of themselves, not always. But I've never really wanted to do that. Certainly for me as a reader, the pleasure has always been, being able to unzip myself from my skin and slip into someone else's life and see the world from their point of view. I read a lot of historical fiction because it's the closest I'll ever get to time travel, and I just sort of want to experience, what was it like, to be in the British Navy in the 19th century and, seeing the South Seas for the first time. I want to feel that. And so a lot of times I work not from how is this character like me, but how is this character different from me? And then the other thing is, for me, when I write a story, it usually begins with a concept. I come up with an idea that I think is clever, that has a big fat hook that will make people want to read. One of my first successful short stories was called Pop Art. And it was about a friendship between a juvenile delinquent and an inflatable boy, Arthur Roth. And Arthur's made of plastic, he's filled with air, and weighs 6 ounces, and if he sat on a sharpened pencil, it would kill him. You know, and like that feels like a fun concept. But I can actually only write on a good concept for about 2-3 days. But after 2 or 3 days, if I don't have a great character, you know, someone to investigate, someone who fascinates me, the story is dead in the water, even if the idea was great. I've got a whole drawer full of half-finished stories where the concept was great, but there was just no one I cared about enough to keep writing. You know, I want to meet people who have made mistakes, who have regrets, who are angry, who, you know, want to make amends, who, you know, have bizarre enthusiasms. And I want to spend time with them and get to know them. That's why I write. They aren't always, you know, one thing I've heard a lot about Heart-Shaped Box, for example, you know, Judas Coin is a pretty nasty piece of work. When we first meet him, you know, you're kind of rooting for the ghost. But then the book goes on and you begin to think, oh, maybe he's not so bad. Maybe that anger, you know, that he projects, that you know, that almost violent outward face is actually a kind of armor that's trying to protect someone who's been hurt again and again and again by people who shouldn't have hurt him. And actually, maybe he cares about people a lot more than he's willing to admit, even to himself. And I thought that was kind of hopeful and exciting. I wanted to see if that was true, if Jude was a better man even than he thought he was. And I'd say that that's been true through all the novels, that I found people where I've thought, why is this person like this? How'd they get this way? And then the book becomes my way of tracking down their truth and figuring them out.
Wow, that was a really good response. How does your creative process differ when creating outlines or you know, coming up with ideas and characters? How does it differ from writing, you know, a novel and book versus like comic books?
Yeah.
Does the collaborative nature of comic books working with like a team, you know, present more opportunities or different obstacles? Like, what is the difference in your process?
Well, one thing is I don't outline. I learned from my father that outlines are tools of the devil. And so I avoid them at all costs. You know, I write from situation and character. You know, if I have a vivid character that I'm excited about, and I can put them in a gripping situation, I don't need to outline. I can just let them do whatever they would naturally do in that situation and follow them for as long as it goes. And so I don't really, a lot of times when I begin a story, I have little more than a few scenes, and I don't know how it's going to end. And, you know, and probably this is one of the reasons I'm slow, because in the course of writing a story, a lot of times I'll make mistakes and have to track back, you know, and throw 50 pages out and start again. In terms of the difference between writing novels and writing comics, most of my comic book business, most of my life in the comic book business has been occupied with one title, which is Lock and Key, that I've spent, I don't know, I've been writing for almost 15 years. I've been writing for 15 years now. Every page of Lock and Key has been drawn by Gabriel Rodriguez. And Gabe and I are like an old married couple. You know, we finish each other's sentences, we laugh at all the same. The thing about me and Gabe is I can start a joke and I don't need to finish it because he's already laughing. Gabe designed my wedding ring.
Oh, wow.
You know, and when I write a script, usually for Lock and Key, I'm writing because I'm excited to see Gabe draw a page. You know, every time I write a page, I'm like, what would be awesome to see Gabe draw? You know, and he always, whatever he does is always even better than I thought it would be, and my expectations are very high at this point. Lock and Key, almost every issue has been done by exactly the same crew. Chris Ryle, who was the best man at my wedding. Jay Photos, who's done all the colors. Robbie Robbins did the lettering up until a few years ago, and Sean Lee does the lettering now. And you know, writing is a lonely business. You spend a lot of time by yourself in your office, listening to the voices in your head. And And writing comics is a thrill because it's the closest I'll ever come to knowing what it's like to be in a band like the Rolling Stones. You know, like I feel like, you know, we do a comic and we're in the studio together and, you know, I get excited by what Gabe's drawing and I want to write something even better, and then he gets excited by what I wrote and you know, he wants to draw something even more amazing, and Jay Photo's colors turn it all into this, you know, so the pages just glow. I always think that Jay, who doesn't get enough credit, you know, it's not like he's coloring the page, it's like he's lighting it. Like a, you know, like a movie, like the guy who does lighting in a film. His use of sunlight is just astonishing, and you take it for granted if you're not, you know, unless you're seeing it happen to a black and white page. The one thing I will say, okay, so the one concrete thing I can say about the difference is, when I started writing my Lock and Key scripts, a script for a 24-page issue was usually between 70 and 100 pages. So I would write a 100-page script for a 24-page comic. But now, when I write one, a 24-page comic the script might be 30 pages. Because Gabe and I get each other. There's so much I don't need to say, because Gabe will just know. You know, and writing a novel or a short story is a completely different thing, because I want every sentence to have a little music in it, you know. I don't want it to show off. I don't want it to tap dance, you know, but I want the reader to feel like, you know, that it's tuneful. And I don't have to worry about that so much with, you know, a comic book script, which no one is going to see except, you know, 5 guys.
Yeah. Well, unless you release like a, you know, collector box set that includes all those goodies. I mean,
I do, and those sometimes have come out. But even those, once I know the readers are going to see them, I edit them. You know, I go through and I'm like, oh, that's a clunker.
Can you recall like your first conscious exposure to comic books, like the one maybe that made you a fan?
Yeah, I can, and it's really weird. So I'm like, you know, it doesn't make sense from my generation. I grew up in the 1980s, but the first comics that really lit me up so in the 1950s, the most popular comics in America were horror comics. They were, you know, the gross out comics like, you know, Vault of Fear, Tales from the Crypt, and there was a set of congressional hearings in the 1950s, the Kuffer Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, where a guy named Frederick Wortham, a Freudian, came out and presented a bunch of junk science, saying basically that the horror comics were to blame for juvenile delinquency. And it destroyed the comic business overnight and destroyed the horror comics. And years and years, and also those fights over comic books in the 1950s presaged every cultural fight we've had since. They always play out exactly the same. It's always you know, the same arguments. You know, something is going to happen to the kids because they're being exposed to Twisted Sister. Something is going to happen to the kids because they're listening to rap music. Something is going to happen to the kids because they're playing Call of Duty. And it goes around and around and around. It's like America never has any new ideas. We just have to keep fighting the same stupid battles every 5 years. But the horror comics were recollected in the 1980s as a series of beautiful hardcovers, all the EC comics. And my dad had them and let me read them. And I was completely absorbed, completely gripped by those. I just loved Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror and Haunt of Fear. And so those were the first comic books that really, really mattered to me. And then I was swept up in the 1980s. There was the British invasion in comics. So there was Neil Gaiman, who wrote Sandman. There was Alan Moore, who wrote Swamp Thing. Yeah, Neil's a genius. Grant Morrison, who wrote, oh wait, no, it was Jamie Delano wrote Hellblazer. Right, I think, we got that right? I don't know. Anyway, I read all that stuff, and it was like the horror comics had been reborn. The 1950s only smarter and more literary and grosser and scarier. And so those were, when I think about the writers who really inspired the kind of stuff I write, it's those guys who wrote those comics in the 1980s. It's Alan Moore and it's Neil Gaiman. Also, I loved a lot of the gross out writers. It was called Splatterpunk at the time, and the head of that group was Clive Barker. I loved the Books of Blood. I loved Clive Barker. I loved Peter Straub. I love Stephen King. I was a big Stephen King fan. huge Stephen King fan.
All very appropriate answers.
I got to tell you, only the second grown-up book I ever read was It, when it was in manuscript form. And when it was in third draft, and I had it next to my bed, the manuscript came up almost to my knee. And I mean, I just blew through that thing in like a week. But the version I read was about 200 pages longer than the version all you guys read, so I got to see all the extra scenes you guys missed out on. I got to read all that.
Flex, that's a flex. I want to move this conversation to TV and film real quick.
Yeah.
Something you brought up about Lock and Key. You're not very active on social media, and I understand it's because you value your time. You also spend a lot of time reading and writing. But I did get a chuckle from this tweet that you put out over the summer. You wrote, "This July 4th, do your patriotic duty and see Indiana Jones punching Nazis on the big screen, which is what the Founding Fathers would have wanted."
I stand by that. Yeah, I stand by that.
You finished the tweet with, "It's a heartfelt, jolting masterpiece." And I think everyone here agrees with that sentiment. I can only imagine like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, like 2 thumbs up. So I'm curious to know, out of all of the TV and film properties that have been adapted from your stories, like, do you have a personal favorite? Like, do you feel like one might have landed or stuck the landing the best?
Right. Well, I wouldn't knock any of them because, I'm always interested to see what someone will do when they adapt a story for film or for TV. And I've been very lucky, I think, that everyone who has adapted something from my work has gone at it with good faith, and done their heartfelt best to make something special. That said, I think my favorite of them, you won't be surprised to hear, is Scott Derrickson's The Black Phone, which came out last summer, and I just thought was so wonderful and is a real collaboration in the sense of that film was based on a short story that I wrote in 2003, and I sold it to a British horror magazine. I couldn't sell anything in America, but I sold it to a British horror magazine for £35. Or about $40 American, and they never sent me the check either. So, but when you see the movie, 1/3 of the movie is the short story, and it is everything in the short story, line for line, all the dialogue, everything. And as a writer, to see such a pure adaptation is very satisfying. But if it was just the short story, it would have been half hour long. So there's also a lot of material there about growing up in dirty, rundown North Denver in the late 1970s. And that is Scott Derrickson talking about his own childhood. And I think that's the emotional core of the film, and the core of the relationship between their kids and their abusive father. And that gives the film a lot of potency. And then the other thing is Scott's co-screenwriter is C. Robert Cargill, an excellent novelist and screenwriter. He wrote Doctor Strange, he wrote Sinister, and C. Robert Cargill looked at the short story and said, "This is an escape room." I can make a movie that's an escape room. And so the film has this whole escape room mechanic to it. You know, how's he going to get out of that basement? And the ghosts keep calling on the phone to give him another clue, to help him out with some new idea. And that's the other third of the film. And those three components are like, you know, it's like the base of the pizza, the tomato sauce, and the cheese. It's perfect. They made a perfect pizza.
Are you hungry, Joe?
It is almost lunch, in my defense.
Who here has seen a black phone on Oh, fantastic. There you go.
Some of you guys have even gone to the haunted house that was at Universal Studios. Oh, cool. A few. Raise your hands if you've been to the haunted house. It's going to be, are they going to do it again? Will it be black phone? Universal did the black phone sort of haunted house experience in Florida and in California at their theme parks, and I didn't get to go. They had a bunch of black phone swag in the gift shop, and I didn't even get any of the swag. My adult boys went in California, and they bought me every T-shirt that was for sale there. So I would have the 3 different T-shirts, and I appreciate them for that. But come on, Universal, where's mine? Come on, send me a T-shirt for God's sake.
Pay my man. Come on. You know, speaking about a haunted house, a month ago, you were interviewed on NPR to give your personal recommendations for the best spooky reads for summer.
Yeah.
Some of those recommendations, I've got The Wishing Pool and Other Stories, Hidden Pictures, and The Last House on Needless Street. Has anyone read any of those books? Oh, fantastic. We got a well-read group here. But it got me thinking of spooky season. You know, we're a week out from October. And, you know, the official start of spooky season. I've got friends that are like, they've already got the lawn stuff ready to go, the inflatables, the lights. And I was wondering, what does Halloween look like at the Hill House? Like, do you guys celebrate? Do you guys go all out?
You know, I live in a cozy little suburb, and you know, no one shows up. I get really excited every year, and I set up all this stuff, and I have the full-size candy bars, and no one turns up, and I just wind up, you know, sadly eating the full-size candy bars myself in front of a horror film. I did have this zombie that was pulling his way out of the ground named Stench. And I used to put Stench in the front yard, you know, and then about 7 years ago, I fell in love with a woman named Jillian Redfern. And Jillian came to the house, and, you know, first time she came to the house, and I showed her around. We went in the basement, and Stench was in the basement. And I saw her look at him and then kind of twitch her head and flinch away, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I waited, and she was upstairs, and she was using this little front room as an office. So I let her go into the office, and she closed the door. I went back downstairs, and I got Stench, and I put him on a stool outside the door. And then I knocked on the door and waited, and I had his hand, and when she started to open the door, I lifted Stench's hand to reach through, and she screamed, and then she slammed the door, and she began screaming, "Take it away!" And I said, "Oh, he's gone. And she said, "No, it isn't." And 2 years later, she married me, which proves anything is possible. Yeah.
Is it safe to assume that Stench was the best man at your wedding?
No, actually, she did make me put Stench in the garbage.
Oh.
Stench has found a new home in landfill.
Rest in peace. Okay. There we go. I was just about to bring up the Q&A.
Sorry to interrupt the flow of such a wonderful conversation, but we are going to open up to our audience questions. So I just want to say thank you guys for such a wonderful interview thus far.
We're going to answer all these questions, so I hope no one had anything to do for the next 4.5 hours. We've locked the doors.
Oh, you cannot get out. You are locked in. So we are going to open it up to the questions submitted by our audience prior to the program. So I'll go ahead, hand them over to Bod, and we'll go through them all, and it should be even more fun of a time.
Did you want me to grade these?
Yes, I want you to go through them, grammar and all.
Okay.
I have to tell you that I have to, even Botten doesn't know this, but I have to go on his comic book podcast now because I lost my baseball cap, And I thought to myself, that's gone. And he said, let me go look for it. And he disappeared into the streets of Jacksonville and came back with it 5 minutes later. So now I have to go on his podcast.
He didn't even know, all right? You just described me like I was a bloodhound. I was like, in the streets of Jack. Okay, first question I got here. What has been your favorite book or character to write?
Favorite book or character to write? You know, it sucks to answer a question with the cliche, but my favorite book is always the one that I'm working on. I've got a new novel finished in second draft called King Sorrow, and I'm very excited for King Sorrow. It'll be out in 2025. I have to do a third draft, and then it has to go through the publishing pipeline. So spring 2025, mark your calendar, that's when King Sorrow is out. But in the meantime, I've started the book after King Sorrow, which is called Hunger. And so right now, Hunger is my favorite book I've ever worked on. I probably won't feel that way after I'm done working on it, you know, and I've gone on to something else. But at the moment, Hunger is my favorite thing. In terms of my favorite character that I've ever worked on, okay, so I've got a funny answer for that one. I always wanted to write a series character. You know, I read a lot of series fiction. One of my favorite writers is Florida author John D. MacDonald, and I loved his creation, Travis McGee. I said I like historical fiction. I've been reading my way through the Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey and Matron series. I love those books and stuff. And I always wanted to have my own series character. And at a certain point about 5 years ago, I realized I do. And my series character is a house. So my favorite character to write about has been Key House, the house in Lock and Key. That's, you know, the house is full of 100 enchanted keys. Every key opens a different door and activates a different supernatural power. And I have found that house endlessly interesting to revisit through the years.
Very good answer. Really quick on the topic of King Sorrow, I had a question. We don't have to go really fully into it considering how many questions I got, but I was trying to find information on what King Sorrow was going to be about, and I think the number one Google, you know, result I got was a comment on Reddit. It was someone who attended, I think, a recent reading you did of King Sorrow.
Yeah, I've read a couple pieces. I have occasionally done appearances where I read a little bit, yeah.
Well, this particular Reddit comment described King Sorrow as, quote, what if Friends was a horror novel? And,
yes.
and I was curious, like, how accurate is that comparison or that statement?
It's a little bit like it is. If I had to sort of give the one sentence elevator pitch, what if the gang and Friends adopted a dragon? It is like the horror movie version of Friends, but it begins in 1989 and continues to the modern day, and was a little bit of my way of reflecting on, you know, the way my generation screwed up the world. Sorry.
Who's going to be checking for King Sorrow next year? There we go. Okay, I really like this question considering that we are at a book fest. What book are you currently reading?
Well, I'm glad you asked that one because you mentioned, I was on NPR and I talked about some recent horror that I've liked. One was a collection of stories by Tananarive Due called The Wishing Pool. I loved Tananarive's work for a long time. She has an amazing horror novel coming out on Halloween called The Reformatory, which is a ghost story that's set in a place a little bit like Florida's infamous Dozer School for Boys. And it's incredibly chilling. The pages absolutely fly. And it also just has a generosity about human beings that's very moving. I've thought she had, you know, that it was only a matter of time before she dropped a really, really big book on everyone. And I think that this is it, that this is the kind of book that wins a whole bunch of prizes. It's great. And just an absolute page turner. So that's a great one. And it's out in like a month.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you guys know where to go get that book, either Jack's Library or the San Marco Bookstore. All right. Is there a genre outside your normal comfort zone that you'd like to try?
Hunger is a ghost story, but it's also a historical novel. So it's not set in the, I've wanted to write something historical for a long time, and so hunger scratches that itch. I've only done historical fiction 2 other times, only in comic books. So in Lock and Key, I wrote a storyline set during World War I in the Helen Gone series. That was fun to write. It involved a ridiculous amount of research for 48 pages of comics. And then I also wrote, when I was working on Basket Full of Heads and Plunge, there was a backup feature in the Hill House comics called Sea Dogs. Because I was thinking about the Revolutionary War, and I couldn't figure it out. You know, how did America beat the British Army, which was the greatest fighting force in the world, with an overpowering navy? I just couldn't figure out how we did it. And then one day it hit me. Werewolves. We beat them with werewolves. So Sea Dogs is set on a 70-gun ship, a 70-gun British ship where the Patriots have, slyly inserted 3 passengers who are werewolves, and they start killing the crew by night.
I think I do remember that lesson in 8th grade history class, the werewolf chapter.
Yeah.
That was it.
It's funny, the history classes almost glide right over it, but it's, yeah.
Okay, what do you recommend to improve your craft? Books, classes, writing groups?
I think if you want to write, the best way to develop your voice and is to do the thing. You've just got to sit there and play make believe every day. Even if it's only 20 minutes. We live in a world of distraction. Everyone has 20 minutes, but we tend to blow it looking at Twitter on our phone or something. And if you could just not just take 20 minutes and do 100 words, that's 1,000 words in 2 weeks. 100,000 words makes a novel. You could write a novel in a year or 2 years, and even if it sucks, you wrote a novel. And you learned in the process of doing it. You learned something about how to put together a story. The next thing you write will be better. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's useful. Reading regularly is useful. I had a nervous breakdown and a divorce after I wrote my first novel, and writing the second novel is the devil. I had a really hard time with the second novel, and I didn't know how to. As I said at the beginning, I was unprepared for success. I was much more prepared for failure. And one thing that I did when I was working on the second novel was I had some friends loan me a house there was nothing in it. It was a totally empty house. There was a desk in it, nothing else. And I would go there to write, but I brought with me an Elmore Leonard novel called The Big Bounce. And for a while, I love Elmore. I love his stuff. And for a while, I was kind of lying. I wasn't really going there to write. I was just going there to sit and read and feel bad. And then one day I got an idea. I was just loving The Big Bounce, and I thought, what if I rewrote the book myself and gave it away free on the internet? I could call it The Bigger Bounce, and I could start to change things and give it a new ending. So then I started writing Elmore Leonard. I would copy a page out and type in the computer sentence for sentence, and as I went, I just wanted to hear his sentences in my head. I just wanted to feel like, what was it like to put this on the page? And then I would start to change things as I went along. And then after I had copied a page of Elmore Leonard, I'd exit that document and I opened the document of the book I was working on, Horns, and I'd start writing Horns. And it was easy. I glided right from Elmore Leonard into Horns. And when I read Horns now, when I look at it, which I try never to do, because I think it's a good book, but I just feel bad when I look at it. But, I don't think it reads anything like Elmore Leonard. There's a density to the prose that Elmore Leonard would be like, forget that, no way. But there was an energy that I was able to borrow. Elmore saved me. I was able to surf on his energy into my own story. And so I actually think that's not a bad thing to try. If there's a writer you love, try just copying a couple pages out. See what it's like to write their sentences. You'll learn something. You'll learn something about the way a good sentence sounds, the way a scene is constructed. You know, you'll learn something about not just what they chose to write, but what they didn't write. You know, a lot of times you'll be shocked because you'll be copying out someone, you know, you love, and you'll be like, oh, they never described this character, but I see them so vividly. I know exactly what they're wearing. I know exactly how they cut their hair. But the writer never mentioned any of that. You know, they didn't need to because the writer knew you'd imagine it. You know, so that kind of thing can be really useful, but, you know, you just got to do the thing, and don't make plans to do the thing. You know, don't spend a lot of time planning a schedule. Spend 20 minutes to do the thing. You'll feel better afterwards.
That's fantastic advice. On the topic of horns, this next question relates to that. What was your thought process as you outlined and wrote horns?
Yeah.
I guess we got to that one. All right, let me switch it up. I'll take that blunder. That was a blunder. What was your favorite scene to be in Creepshow?
Oh, well, I've talked about this a little bit in the introduction to Full Throttle. You know, it's easy to assume that I wound up writing horror because my dad writes horror. Well, that is part of it. I love Stephen King novels. I learned almost everything I know about writing from reading Stephen King novels. You know, I love my dad. I love his work, and you know, I'm as big a Stephen King fan as, you know, any Stephen King fan out there. But in the 1980s, my dad made a movie with his friend George Romero. They made a film called Creepshow, which was about the horror comics from the 1950s. See it all, it's like a snake eating its own tail. It all goes around and around. So they made this movie Creepshow that was a love letter to comic books like Tales from the Crypt, and they stuck me in it. I was the little boy named Billy, and his father takes away his horror comics, and the kid gets even with his dad by using a voodoo doll on him. And I was on the set for a week filming my bit. And at that time in the 1980s, child labor laws were very different, especially around film. So there was no on-set nanny or on-set tutor. There was no one to like look after me. And my dad was also in the film. He played this guy named Jody Verrill, who turns into a walking pile of moss. And you know, and so and he had to film his bits. And so George Romero asked special effects artist Tom Savini to look after me. I spent a week in Tom Savini's trailer watching him artistically disfigure movie stars and create monsters. There was a monster in the film, the creature in the crate, which had big claws, and Tom had the claws in his makeup effects trailer, and I would wear them, and I would crouch under his work table, and when people came in, I'd go, ah, and go with their ankles, you know, like a rabid chimpanzee, and you know, and sometimes they'd scream, and I'd know I had scared them, and there was power in that. And I thought that power was fascinating. So by the time I left Creepshow, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to murder people in inventive ways and create unforgettable creatures. And that's actually what I did. I just do it on paper instead of with special, you know, latex makeup effects. As it happens, as it is sort of coded to the story, I'm still friends with Tom Savini now. I think he is a great American artist, and you know he's been doing gross out special effects since Dawn of the Dead and Friday the 13th. He's the godfather of gore. It was great to stick him in Lock and Key. We got him into Nosferatu. He was my first rock star, and you know, as far as I'm concerned, he always will be a rock star.
For a minute, I thought that was going to be like the, that also sounds like a villain origin story, too. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one other question. I'm going to let you take your pick. I've got an existential writer question, or my favorite, a nerdy comic book question.
Oh, let's have nerdy comic book question.
All right, here we go. and you might have semi-answered this, but let's see if we can't get a different one out of you. If you could write a major comic book character, who would it be and why?
The thing is I've done it a couple times and I sucked. You know, I mean, because I was so excited to get a chance to write a Spider-Man story, you know, but I just blew it, you know. It was just like, you know, I was so excited, but then they wanted me to change this, they wanted me to change that. I was too eager to please, and I you know, and eventually my story became a completely generic and forgettable Spider-Man story. I really wanted to do a Doctor Strange because my friend Scott Derrickson and C. Robert Cargill had made the Doctor Strange film, and he was a longtime favorite character of mine. You know, I did a one-page throwaway about Doctor Strange with Michael Allred. Incredible art. I've actually got the page too, because he lettered right on the page and stuff, and it's like one of my favorite possessions. Incredible. But again, it wasn't like a great story. It's okay. It was a story about Doctor Strange washing his cape. You know, getting his cape, and his cape doesn't want to go in the washing machine, so he fights with it. You know, and I would love to, you know, there are a few characters I would love to have tackled. I'd really like to write Superman, you know, but I don't think it's ever going to happen.
What is it about Superman that draws you to him as a character? Because, you know, like the kind of cliche thing you hear from a lot of people is like, yeah, Superman's kind of boring. He can do it all. Like, but what draws you to him?
But I like the idea of writing about goodness and you know, and decency, unfailing decency. You know, in a world that lacks, you know, this world is not suffering from, you know, too much goodness and too much decency. And there's something about putting that, you know, getting a chance to explore that seems really powerful. I like Superman's innocence, and I like that Superman believes that we can be better than we really are, you know. And so, I mean, actually, if I was going to write a character in Marvel Comics, it would probably be Captain America, and for much the same reasons. But, you know, when I get asked to write a comic, and it's a mainstream character, it's usually like, how would you like to write Man-Thing? You know, I'm a horror guy, so it's got to be like one of those.
You're like, there's more to me than the horror.
Right, there's more to me, right? There's more to me than, you know, swamp creatures, but, you know, swamp creatures as it is. Yeah.
Well, as a diehard comic fan, I can't wait to see what you do in the realm of comic books. I can't wait for King Sorrow. And Joe, I think on behalf of the entire stage.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was wonderful. I had a great time. Thanks for coming out and listening to it.
Thank you.
To listen to us blab.